As you know, I was in the UK a few months ago, and as it turns out, those folks really love their double-decker buses, as we know. Whether it was in central London or winding my way from my Heathrow industrial area hotel to my nearest Elizabeth line station, I saw and rode a lot of double-decker buses over my trip to London. All of it made me think a bit about something I've long thought. We don't have enough double-decker buses in most of the world, and in North America, of course. But are there actually good reasons for that? And besides bus fans, does anyone even really care if we have double-decker buses? If you're not already and you like the video, you should like it and consider subscribing. Now, I do think it's important to start this video off by noting that double-decker buses aren't exclusive to London or even the UK. Obviously, double-decker buses are quite popular in a lot of places around the world, from Hong Kong to Singapore, videos on both of those cities soon, to even places like Berlin and Toronto. That being said, they are everywhere in London. And that's even true on the routes where the capacity of a double-decker bus probably isn't even necessary, and that really made me think. Why don't we have more of them, especially over here across the pond? Well, if you ask your average transit enthusiast, they'll tell you a litany of reasons that we don't use double-deckers more often. But as is so often the case, I think these are less reasons we don't use double-deckers and just the reasons we say we don't use double-deckers. For one, double-decker buses are tall, which can make them impractical in a lot of places, from bus terminals and bus loops to even just driving down highways that might have tunnels or low bridges. And you also have issues with things like power lines and foliage that could get in the way of that nice upper deck. There's also the very well-known, or at least well-talked-about, capacity issue with double-decker buses, which is that if you have a bus that's so large and has few doors, well, naturally dwell times are going to be longer, and this really restricts you. And I've even talked about that in the past on my channel. Of course, using articulated buses as an alternative to double-decker buses just seems to make sense, especially in North America where we have lots of road space. You get more seats, but you also get a lot more doors, which is nice, and it's kind of like a tram, but worse. I think the thing is, with a lot of these reasons, they fall into the we assume and aren't really committed to making this thing work, and so it doesn't work category. But that's bad. There are a lot of issues with public transport, but I think one of the big ones is that too often we are obsessed with making it unexciting and not focusing on making it so that people's time on public transit is enjoyable. And I think a double-decker bus, along with things like Japan's love of playing music at railway stations and Switzerland's love of railways into the mountains, are one of those things that people just really enjoy and connect with on a sort of emotional level. And the thing that brings me to that conclusion is, beyond the fact that double-decker buses are kind of famous in London and they're kind of an icon of the city that people always like to think and talk about and take pictures of, is that every time double-decker buses get introduced in a North American city, it's kind of the same process. Transit agency announces they're doing double-decker buses cautiously, they're not sure if people are going to love them, maybe it's a pilot project. They roll them out, and then people really enjoy them, and they talk about how comfortable they are and the nice views and stuff like that, and the transit agency tends to continue using them. Now, I do want to address the pleasant ride, comfortable, joyous thing, but let's also address some of the issues that people do bring up with double-decker buses. Now, with regard to the height issue, people do talk a lot about that, but I think it's less of a problem than we often assume. Sure, in lots of cities there are many low bridges, and that can truly be a restriction on using double-decker buses widely. But especially on the highway express routes, which they so often are used for in North America, to great success, double-decker buses are actually fantastic, especially because in North America, we have a lot of highways for one, but also we tend to build our highways with large vehicles in mind. Highways, and especially giant American interstates, are typically built so that giant trucks can roll through carrying giant cargo, which indeed is often very tall, and so the clearances and stuff don't tend to be a huge issue on most highways. Of course, at the same time, if there are certain routes where double-decker buses just won't fit in your city, you can just use single-deck buses, and having a mixed fleet is totally okay. London, for example, has lots of single-decker buses alongside its double-decker buses. But just because you can't use them everywhere doesn't mean you shouldn't use them anywhere. And of course, if you actually have a lot of double-decker buses and they're successful and popular, that's a little more incentive to raise the bridge next time you replace it or upgrade it. So it's worth considering that as well. Now, with regard to capacity and frequency, I want to augment what I've said in the past, which is that double-decker buses probably don't make sense on high-frequency routes where you want to have shorter dwell times. Basically, double-decker buses have a lot of seats, but still probably only as many doors as a regular city bus, meaning people are going to have to spend more time getting on and off at each stop. While I still think that's generally true, I do think there are some nuances here that are worth thinking about. While it probably doesn't make sense running double-decker buses on a route where buses are packed and operating every 5 minutes, because that's where dwell time really is important, on the average bus route in North America, or in most places in the world, where buses are running every 10 or 15 minutes, the dwell time impacts of double-decker buses, especially when they aren't absolutely packed to the gills, probably isn't that big. At the same time, if you are running packed buses every 5 minutes, you're probably looking at building a tram or some other form of rail, because it's not very efficient to move so many people across so many small vehicles. At the same time, with regard to dwell time, the way people use double-decker buses is fundamentally not the same as regular city buses that you see in a lot of the world. People don't tend to crowd the lower deck quite as much as they crowd the single deck of a regular city bus, because there's a whole upper deck that they can comfortably sit in. And so what you tend to see is people head down just before their stop and get off, lest they miss their stop, which most people try to avoid when riding a bus. And so the big impacts you might expect on dwell time are a little less of an issue for that reason as well. And even with those dwell time impacts, if getting buses moving faster through our cities is a huge priority, as it should be, we can just build some more queue jumps and dedicated lanes and completely offset any negative impact of a more comfortable bus that maybe takes a little longer at each stop. Perhaps this could incentivize cities like Toronto to consolidate some stops, for example, because in a lot of cities, Toronto being kind of bad on this, bus stops are often really close together, something I noticed seemed to be less of a problem in London. Now, I do think there's actually one main legitimate concern about double-decker buses in North America, but it kind of exposes a broader problem here in North America. So let's discuss what that is. Well, we basically only have one option, Alexander Dennis, who makes buses for Toronto, Las Vegas, Seattle, Vancouver, and most places that have double-decker buses in North America. Now, since we have one model of bus, I think that probably leads to those buses being more expensive, but also probably less well designed than they would be otherwise, and I don't think that's great. But it's a symptom of a bigger problem we have in North America with one of our policies. You see, we often see transit as a means to an end, but an end that isn't actually transportation. Whether it be primarily about a real estate development project, or primarily about a street reconfiguration, or primarily a way of fueling local non-competitive industries. Basically, in North America, you generally have to buy buses from North America. There have been a few exceptions, but generally that's not a continuing trend because you have to pay a lot more if you go outside of the North American market. What this means is that we're practically limited to two major bus manufacturers, who have less incentive to compete with each other and actually innovate. And that's not to say that I don't think we have some nice local buses with pretty decent build quality here in North America. It's just that I think we could do so much better. But without having overseas bus companies that make, in my opinion, some really nice and attractive buses competing with our local industries, it's hard to push them to do better. It's interesting, but when you compare buses to trams or metro rolling stock, which we do tend to use designs for from overseas, even if we do manufacture it locally, I would say that you generally see better, more world-class vehicles in rail systems because, again, there's more competition for better designs. I think this is all probably most obvious in the uncomfortable, uninspiring, and not super creative designs that we tend to see in North America. I don't see a great reason that we shouldn't have a more open bus market. And instead of having local companies design and manufacture all buses, we could have some local companies doing this, but also some foreign companies which can still make buses locally, but can bring in designs from overseas. Which could all lead to us building and designing better buses even with our domestic companies. Of course, it just generally makes sense to get designs from places like Europe and Asia because these are places where public transit is more intensively used. And so naturally they seem like places where you're more likely to see innovations in public transport vehicle design. And I think that's the case. That we put transit behind keeping our local companies afloat seems counterproductive, because the price of that means a worse experience for all of our transit riders. And a worse experience for transit riders probably means less people on transit, which probably also means less buses to buy in the first place, which is generally one of the problems I think we face in North America. Our policies create vicious cycles. If you design your transit in an unfriendly way, you get less riders, and less riders get you less transit. It's not a good place to be, whether you're a rider or a company producing vehicles for public transit. And I think all of this has a real impact. Cars, pardon the metaphor, get redesigned every few years, meaning that the car industry often inspires or is at least on top of a lot of design trends. And even though we have way too many cars, I think most people can appreciate that at least some cars have nice designs, and having a wide market of cars that people can choose from probably helps with this. And indeed, in North America, you can buy a European car, but you can't really buy a European bus, which seems really silly. Naturally, if we admire European companies for their ability to design a sleek, attractive vehicle that's safe and high quality to, I don't know, drive around diplomats or just drive regular people around, the same should definitely be true for buses, right? Now, some people might say that having super attractive or fancy buses is bad, because governments should be frugal. But if people aren't happily and excitingly using one of the modes that provides the most affordable, efficient, environmentally friendly, and equitable forms of transportation, then are we actually being frugal or efficient in the long game? Now, putting these concerns about manufacturing and industrial policy aside, I also do think we have less double-decker buses because we have less double-decker buses. It's really a self-perpetuating cycle. You see, when a transit agency is buying new buses, it probably looks to the existing fleet it has and says, let's buy more of whatever is reliable. At least that's what I see in most of the cities I follow. And the issue is, if you don't have many or any double-decker buses, you're probably not going to want to take a risk on buying some and having them potentially break down or not be compatible with different infrastructure in your city, or not being able to work with your garages, which are not designed for double-decker buses because you don't have double-decker buses. That means in many ways it has to be a concerted effort to get a specific kind of vehicle. And far too often in North America and in other parts of the world where the fine details of how vehicle design influences whether people enjoy transit and ride transit, this just isn't that common. For us to see transit agencies using more double-decker buses, I think we need to present strong arguments in favor of them, and I do think those exist. As I mentioned before, I don't think capacity is nearly as much of an issue with double-decker buses as we might imagine. And even if double-decker buses are a little more expensive than standard buses, if they really do attract more ridership or provide a better user experience to riders, then the cost is probably worth it. While in this channel and on Twitter and in other places, I'm generally pretty critical of the fact that we spend too much to get too little here in North America, I think spending more on a vehicle to provide a legitimately better passenger experience is money well spent. That's especially true with buses for a couple of reasons. One of the big pluses of double-decker buses is that they're really quite comfortable, which helps a lot. My experience on regular low-floor city buses generally isn't great. I don't tend to find the seating super comfortable, and I find the ride even worse. And if you've ever had to stand on a long bus journey, you know just how incredibly unpleasant it is. But even when you do get a seat, most city buses tend to have kind of awkward layouts and uncomfortable seats. Often you're facing sideways or jammed up against another seat, and that isn't great. And I actually think that more so than with metro trains, for example, not sitting forward facing is kind of an issue when your ride is constantly swaying back and forth, jolting forward and backwards and going over lots of bumps. This is where double-decker buses really shine, because most people can be accommodated sitting facing forward in a regular seat on the top deck. And those seats, being well configured, can have nice amenities like direct air conditioning and plugs and the like, which are really nice to have. Basically, while I can train surf and stand without holding on when I'm on a train, the same just isn't true of buses, and I think that's part of why double-deckers are so comfortable. But I think there's a bigger undervalued element to double-decker buses, and that's just the fact that they're fun and pleasant. It's odd to say, but I think that even in transit-friendly places, and by transit-supportive people, buses are typically looked at as less than when compared to trains. And that's enough of an effect that I often hear people arguing that we should shape policy decisions about what transit we build or where we build transit based on the fact that people just don't like buses. Whether that be not running more frequent buses because people probably won't ride more frequent buses because they're buses. Buses are uncomfortable. Or that we should build a tram to replace bus lines, even if it won't actually improve service in a meaningful way, because people just don't like buses. But at the same time, you rarely see the inverse. You rarely see the justification that we should build some transit because it's pleasant and enjoyed by riders. And I think that the case here is actually really strong. Saying that we should buy more double-decker buses because people tend to find them comfortable and tend to enjoy riding on them is actually really reasonable, especially if we want to get people onto public transit. So yeah, when I was in London, I wasn't just reminded of how good a good train network can be, but I was also reminded how even the little things, like buses, can be a real joy. Thanks for watching.